As for me, well, by now you know who I am. I'm Senén Florensa, the Executive President in IEMed, and I will try to make a short presentation, as short as I can, about the socio-economic aspects of the Spanish transition. Yesterday we had the occasion to deal with some political aspects in the first presentation, and then the concrete and very interesting, in my feeling, approach to the security sector reform by our former Minister of Defense and Vice President of the government, with Felipe González. We had today the occasion to hear about this other issue, about the memory, which is always complex because that touches directly the feelings and the nerves of the people. In that respect, well, the distinction probably always bad things are bad, but all things tend to be milder in our memories of bad things than recent things. And this is probably one of the explanations of our transition, because the Spanish Civil War was one of the greatest hecatombs in the 20th century. It is recognized by everybody, and you saw today the numbers of the victims and etc. And it is true, as Vice President Serra expressed yesterday, that the Spanish people at that moment, well, somehow there was a fact to look ahead, and well, maybe to at least for later on other aspects that might disturb the main goal that was at that time to well, to organize a democratic system in Spain after so many years of an authoritarian and at the beginning completely a totalitarian regime. Well, okay. In order to understand the socio-economic aspects of the transition, which is gives a powerful insight on the Spanish transition, in fact, we have to have a bit of historical approach, because it's not understandable otherwise how it happened after 75. As in, you know probably that I was living, for example, in Tunisia for 4 years as a Spanish ambassador over there, and one of the explanations that I give to myself of how Tunisia is the country that is leading this economic transition, I expressed yesterday my belief that no matter how long it lasts, the others will follow, maybe in 30 years, I don't know. But of course the others will follow, but Tunisia is living because it has some socio-economic conditions who are favorable for that, thanks to the effort of all Tunisians, and despite of the very complex and dolorous and difficult political conditions. They have built a society that modestly, because it's at a modest level, has its middle classes, and thanks to the effort of education since the beginning of independence with President Bourguiba and the role of the women, the modernization of the society, etc., they have a socio-economic conditions that let us think that they have the best prospect to really achieve now this democratic transition. So, as it was in our case, they have suffered the suffocating, even if you want to put it that way, authoritarian regime, but below that, the people were working, and they were working and doing what they could for themselves, for their families, for the country, etc. And that allows them now to have the at least minimum socio-economic conditions to have a stable country in democratic processes. Well, similarly to that was the case of Spain. But in the case of Spain, you have to take this kind of historical perspective. We had well, that civil war that we were recalling just half an hour before. And then it was a very dark period, both politically, from a human point of view, and economically. It was an extremely difficult and dark period. For this, Spain had profited, for example, of the First World War and made very good deals with both parties of the First World War. In the Second World War, that's not the case. Spain was destroyed. There was no industry to deal with and sell products to any one of the parties. On the contrary, in the 50s, we had some growth, especially, well, the world had changed. Franco was so more or less accepted in the international politics because of the bipolar confrontation, and of course he was anti-communist, that's obvious. And thanks to the agreements with the United States in '53, some kind of economic transformation started. Not politically, but this growth with no change in the profound economic policy that they inherited from the previous period when they tried to build an autarkic system, etc., well, collapsed. And then comes a very important moment in '59, the stabilization plan, that is the basis for a very long period of growth and economic and social transformation in Spain along the 60s. In 1960, because of this stabilization plan of 1959, we had a negative growth of the GNP, because of the impact of this powerful stabilization plan, which gave way, starting in '61, of a very long period of economic growth and therefore socio-economic transformation, although under political dictatorship, taking advantage, of course, as well of the cycle of economic growth in the Western world. And therefore, there is, during that period, average growth was of about 7% all along that period, varying a little bit, but at that height, only Japan was growing at a higher speed at that period. And this is the basis of the transformation of Japan, by the way, and of Spain. In our case, under a very strong political dictatorship. But as I was explaining, for the case of Tunisia, well, the people were working and developing the country, etc. So this gave not only a change, a very important change in the economic outlook of the country, but a social transformation. The equilibrium model of this economic growth and development has been explained many times, saying that, well, this was confronted because there were we were still under a protectionist system, etc. We were not competitive internationally, and so we had a permanent deficit in the balance of commercial balance, that was compensated, and that was a key factor by remittances. That means that there was a social enormous transformation in Spain, well, because of the emigration from the rural areas to the traditional or newly industrialized areas inside Spain, to the Barcelona area, to Madrid area, to the Basque Country, and to Europe. At one moment, about 1 million Spaniards were working abroad and sending their remittances to Spain. This is the case, for example, as is now in Morocco, where about 9% of the GNP is the foreign remittances of Moroccans working in European countries. That was the same in Spain in the 60s. So it was these remittances of the Spaniards working abroad, and the tourism, which was extremely important for the balance of payments and for the transformation as well of the mentalities. This is the case in Tunisia, by the way, as well, and many other countries. Tourism confronted the people who lived in traditional areas, especially along the coast, with, well, other people who went there from European countries with other attitudes. On top of that, they were on vacation, so they were more free attitudes, etc. And foreign investment. So these three factors financed the necessary imports for the industrialization of the country, and helped to transform the economy and the society in Spain. It's the patterns of consumption started, having these small cars, utilitarian, the Fiat or Seat in our case, 600, etc., etc. Now, at the moment that Franco dies, when Franco dies, unfortunately, it coincides with a world economic crisis because of the oil crisis, the first oil crisis in fall October '73. The price of oil jumps from $2.60 or something dollars per barrel to 14, and one jump to about 12 and then to 14 in a couple of months. And that was at the end of the Franco's life and the Franco's regime. Franco had already some illness in these years. There was a fragility already of the system, and therefore the government did not dare to really translate the impact of the increase of the oil prices to the public. And on the contrary, they even took some compensatory measures, thinking, well, this is something that will pass away, and well, we cannot at that moment impose to the people heavy increase in prices and the cost of the energy, etc., and the repercussion of the cost of energy in all other products. So there was this weakness already of the regime, and that gave way to a cumulative dysfunctionality, so to say, and imbalances in the Spanish economy. Then Franco dies at the end of November '75. You know that, well, there is a first semester where the previous government, almost, where the previous head of government continues. The king finally asks him to present his resignation and appoints President Suarez. And Suarez, in a very quick manner, starts an incredible process of measures of all kinds. Of course, there is the negotiation with all different aspects, politically, with the political parties to legalize them. There were no political parties. There was only one political party, which was conceived as Movimiento Nacional. So the legalization of the communist parties, you know that the legalization of the Communist Party was especially difficult because of the opposition of the military. The military were very much, well, politicized, in fact, although they thought they were not politicized. They were so much politicized that they thought that they were not. They thought that the national interest was the perpetuation of the same kind of system. They were politicized at that point. So to make this military reform or last, at the beginning to prevent them from intervening in the Spanish politics, etc. Then the first general elections in June 15th, June 77. Well, first it was a law for the political reform. Just like 6 months or less after the appointment of Suarez, this law was already approved. That was the harakiri of the old regime. The ability of Suarez and the king and the president of the parliament at that moment, Torquato Fernández Miranda, was to convince the people in the Francoist Cortes, the parliament, so let's call it parliament to let you know what it was, but they were not elected popularly, of course, to convince them to vote a law that would make the whole Franco system disappear and take them away from public life. And well, that was the sense of this whole Spanish transition. It was expressed at that time by Torquato Fernández Miranda, from law to law. And after that, this whole movement for the political transition in that sense starts. We had the general elections and general and constitution and to prepare the constitution. And while the constitution was being prepared and negotiated in the new already elected parliament, finally the Suarez could have the time to, or first the legitimacy, because he formed a new government after the general elections. So with this new legitimacy to undertake what was badly needed already to tackle the economic problem that we already had. By that time, for example, inflation by summer 77 in Spain was already at 27%. Had not the measures been taken at that point, probably would have fallen into a kind of trap of endless increasing inflation, as it happened in some Latin American countries. Suarez appoints Vice President for Economic Affairs, who's Enrique Fuentes Quintana, a very prestigious professor who had been behind already as a young economist of the measures of 59. The measures of 59 were negotiated and prepared for the first time in Spain with the OCDE and the International Monetary Fund. And so it is. He had already participated as an economist, not as a politician, but from the university and from some positions, because he was a civil servant of the Ministry of Economy, in the preparation of all these modernizing measures along the years. He was appointed vice president at that point, and he prepared what was called the Pactos de la Moncloa. And this is the main point I will try to explain briefly to give way to the other presentations. The Pactos de la Moncloa was the socio-economic part of the political pact that was the Spanish transition. And the government, while the constitution was being discussed and drafted in Parliament, after these elections in June 77, September, October, they convened these meetings between the government and the political parties that had won a representation in Parliament, the workers' unions, and the entrepreneurs' associations. They were all represented there. And the government presented, his plan, both politically and economically and socio-economically. And from the political point of view, of course, was what was to be actually included in the constitution that was starting to be negotiated. We are in October 77, and it was explained yesterday, the Constitution was finally approved in December 78. So the political content of the Pacto de la Moncloa, and it was written there, was in fact what was to be the political reform in terms of the new laws for press freedom, speech freedom, association freedom, etc., reform of the judiciary, etc. Then there was an economic part of it, and it was clearly a stabilization pact. Devaluation of the peseta, a stringent monetary policy, fiscal reform to increase states' revenues, etc., to correct these imbalances that could deal away with all possibilities of whatever kind of advancement, politically or socially, in Spain. And in the socio-economic aspect, this was the key to it. The unions, the workers' unions, the three at that point, existing and very powerful workers' unions, accepted that to correct the inflation, for example, wages would be indexed by the foreseen increase in prices for the next year prepared by the economic plan of the government, and not automatically according to the past inflation of the last year, because otherwise it is impossible to stop inflation. So you accept a lower increase in wage under the compromise that the inflation will be lower, provided that if the inflation is higher, then you will get a complementary salary at the end of the year to compensate for that. But at least to preview that, and then a whole package of things, which is what gave way to the existing welfare state in Spain. Of course, under the previous decades, under the Franco regime, and before, there were, of course, an educative system, and a health system, etc. But there is two sides of that. At that point, one of the structural measures, along with the liberalization of authorized prices, etc., to let the market mechanism work better, there was an extremely important tax reform, income tax for the personal income tax, the firm's tax, the entrepreneur, the corporate tax, and that's it, and wealth tax, the new laws, etc., so that the income of the state sharply rised, and that was the basis to finance, so that finally the government put everybody to pay taxes. That was it, in order to be able to finance the social policies that were to be put at work. And this is one of the key issues of the Spanish transition. To put people to pay taxes, of course, mainly the rich people, but with a proportionate, and it's not against the rich people, no, everybody's, in fact, the salaries started to pay more. And since the people who have a salary are much numerous than the rich ones, in fact, the revenue of the state from the salaries is much higher, in fact, than from corporate tax. And then these social measures in education, in pensions, in unemployment indemnizations, subsidies, and so on, and a reform of the fiscal system, as I was saying, in the financial system, liberalization of the banking system, etc., etc. So this was the Pactos de la Moncloa, and so included the whole package composed of, in fact, 3 packages of measures that were implemented in the following months, along with the negotiation and approval of the Constitution. And When this was done, we received the second impact of the oil crisis in '79, so it was a difficult task to get ahead with all that. But this gave way, well, you know that President Suarez resigned, etc. By the way, I was there as a young diplomat. I was in the cabinet of President Suarez when he resigned. I was there from '79 to '83. And we had this attempt coup in February '89. And the new government, when the general elections were called, with the Socialist Party and Felipe González, and this, they had still to face a second wave of economic reforms, mainly with the state-owned companies who were losing money at an incredible speed, and to make a complete industrial reconversion, closing whole sectors as old textile, as naval construction, the construction of ships, as well, and some other minery. Most of the mining was closed, etc. That was a very difficult thing to do, and that was done by the socialist government. And finally, it gave way to this, what the socialists very often call the wonderful decade, which included the Olympic Games in Barcelona, the Seville exposition in '92, etc. I'm stopping there because this was the final result of all that effort. Well, although maybe I have just to point out that the dream finished by 2007, 2008, when we were hit very strongly by the financial and international crisis, and then the economic depression, of which it seems these last even weeks, I would say, not even months, that we may start recovering after all these years of very heavy economic crisis.